What are the Twitter files and why are they so important? Hi, my name's Tony Bersunas. Welcome back to Red, White, and Blind, where the purpose of this show, if you're new here, is to break the spell of the corporate media and to discern the story behind the story. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the Twitter files and why it's so important that Americans understand what they revealed, what they were, and why the media tried to minimize them in many instances. We're also going to be talking about the war in Israel, RFK Jr.'s big announcement and what's going on with his candidacy, and the race for Speaker of the House in the Republican Party. Let's roll the intro and get into the Twitter files. We're going to go a bit chronologically to understand the Twitter files. So if you haven't read my book, Red, White, and Blind, which came out earlier this year, a number of topics in the book do address censorship and social media, and specifically social media censorship of the news, and the role that plays in American media in terms of censorship, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, etc., which are the primary topics of the book and of this show. So before anything to do with the Twitter files dropped, which happened at the end of 2022, at which point my book was already done and off to the publisher, even before that happened, we had a number of instances of censorship on social media. So first of all, there's the instance that I write about in chapter 1 of the book when the Biden laptop story was removed from the news. And I use that as the third example of censorship at the beginning of the book because I think it's a very clear-cut example. Essentially what we had is a laptop belonging to Hunter Biden turned up in a repair shop, and somebody was able to get into it and decipher some of the information on the laptop, including recovering a bunch of emails that Hunter Biden had sent and received. So what happened, this is just a few weeks before the 2020 election, what happened, because there was a sense that this could influence voters because it revealed, or it allegedly revealed, there was a lot of writing and discussion about it in the media, except for when it was censored, that it revealed heightened levels of corruption between the Biden family, and specifically Hunter Biden and his father, Joe Biden, with Ukraine and over the Burisma scandal in Ukraine. So what happened at the time is, as this story broke by the New York Post a few weeks before the election, it was immediately banned by Twitter. You couldn't even read it. You couldn't read the article. You couldn't share the article. It was very strange. And that's why I write about it in the book in this section called A New Kind of Silence in Chapter 1. We can't complete this request. This link has been identified by Twitter as harmful. These are the words on a tweet on my feed in October of 2020. It was just weeks before the presidential election. So this was the New York Post article about Joe Biden's alleged involvement in the Ukrainian corruption scandal. But for some reason, the story was censored. So I wrote about that a bit in the book. Another thing that happened early on that I covered in the book is that during COVID, many people who dissented from the mainstream narratives about things like the origin of the virus, things like natural immunity, what the fatality rate was, the effectiveness of masks or of lockdowns, and then, of course, as the vaccines rolled out, it became even a more difficult media landscape to navigate, partly because social media and mainstream media was censoring one side of the debate on these issues. And something that I spent a lot of time talking about in Red, White, and Blind, although it's not a COVID-focused book. But it was a big deal. And so one of the things that happened was there was shadow banning. Shadow banning is when somebody is censored or their tweets or posts are dialed down, but they don't know about it. So for example, if I'm shadow banned, which I seem to be often on Twitter, I'm not certain, but I used to have my tweets reach many more people, and then suddenly it starts to, you reach fewer and fewer people and you're not exactly sure why. And so for a long time, Twitter said, oh no, we don't do shadow banning. We don't even know what that is. That's not something we'd ever do. 2018, if we just go back, they denied it on their blog. They denied that they'd ever done anything like shadow banning. And then just 2 years later in 2020, there was this hack when some people acquired access to Elon Musk's Twitter account. tweeted out this thing about he'd give away free Bitcoin, and they made off with a bunch of Bitcoin that people sent to this fake account. But what happened during the hack that was very interesting is the hackers revealed the tools they used inside of the Twitter administration. And sure enough, in there were these tags that could be placed on different users that would reduce the spread of them. They'd be like banned, their topics would be prevented from trending, or they themselves would be prevented from trending. So it was very clear that Twitter was doing this. So that's 2020. Also during COVID and in the year or two immediately after in 2021, we did notice many, many people being censored or being shadow banned on Twitter, such as Martin Kulldorff, one of the leading epidemiologists in the world at Harvard, when he would said anything that dissented even sort of insignificantly, but some small dissent from the mainstream narratives. Also, you had people like Jay Bhattacharya, a doctor at Stanford, scientists like Robert Malone, and then even people like Joe Rogan, who are independent media hosts, and many others like him found that their tweets and their posts were sometimes shadow banned. We had people in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, whatever you think about her, it was quite fascinating, I think alarming, to see the level to which social media was shadow banning Marjorie Taylor Greene, a sitting member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, at about this time, Twitter had announced a new CEO. His name was Pradeep Agrawal. And one of the most interesting quotes he provided upon taking over as CEO is he said, "One of the changes today that we see is that speech is easy on the internet. Most people can speak. Where our role is particularly emphasized is who can be heard." So who's coming out and saying part of our role might be to dial down the influence of certain people, which is essentially shadow banning to the extent. So the other important piece of this is, was this censorship and shadow banning a violation of free speech? And this is another thing that I take on in Red, White, and Blind because I think it's a fascinating topic to consider. Just to give the opposing arguments for a moment, people say things like, well, it's a private company, it's not the government. So if Twitter decides they don't want you to speak on their platform, that's they can do whatever they want. They're a private company. The other thing they say is, you can always just go somewhere else and you can just speak your mind somewhere else. So I make 3 points. Briefly, I'll go through them as to why this argument is not very well thought out and not very comprehensively considered. So first of all, social media is the new public square in our country, and that's been mentioned by the Supreme Court, and I think it's clear to anybody that's just living in the United States right now. It's not like you go down to the marketplace and literally take a soapbox, flip it over and stand on top of it, and now you're on your soapbox speaking. That's what a soapbox originally meant, but we don't do that anymore. That's not something that people do. There aren't big markets like that where it's free to just sort of speak your mind. So instead what people do is they go and speak their mind on social media, and that's where we go to connect. That's how we find each other. That's the new public square. The second point is that Twitter is not just any company. It's not like Joe's Pizza on the corner saying, I don't want you to talk about Trump, or I don't want you to talk about Biden while you're eating pizza here. That's fine. He can say that that's not a violation of your free speech. You can go get pizza somewhere else. But Twitter and Facebook and Google, these are monopolies. There is no alternative option, right? And some people will say, well, if you get banned on Twitter, you could go to Facebook. But then we saw that the government was actually interested in having people be banned across all of them at the same time and coordinated shadow banning. And a separate point that I get into in the book is that they're distinct products. Twitter is a distinct product from Facebook. Twitter has a monopoly over Twitter. It's not the same to go on Facebook. If you're really good at Twitter and you're really used to communicating with your audience on Twitter, you can't just go to Facebook and do the same thing, or to Google. They're separate, distinct monopolies of separate, distinct, indispensable services for people that want to communicate politically these days. So the first point is that social media is the new public square. The second is that they're monopolies. And the third is that there's so many interactions between government and these giant tech monopolies that interaction between them is inevitable. And they're always going to be, the government's going to want to reduce speech that opposes its views, and the big corporations are going to want to have either less regulation or the kind of regulation they want. They really depend on Section 230 of the Online Media Decency Act. And so because of that, because of these 3 reasons, when a big tech monopoly like Google or Twitter censors you, it's a violation of your free speech. And we could get into it more. Maybe I'll make a whole separate video on that particular discussion. But what was interesting in my book is we didn't yet have clear evidence that this was going on, that Twitter was actually deliberately shadow banning and censoring people. It was fairly clear, and there were a lot of people with stories. But I suggest in the book it's definitely happening, but I didn't have actual definitive proof in the book. What I suggested and surmised, but didn't have proof for, was that the government was deliberately taking action. So this is why the Twitter files are so fascinating. So now we move forward. 2018, Twitter says, we don't do shadow banning, we don't know what that is. 2020, hacks come out and show that they do have shadow banning, they do have those tools. And then 2022, the Twitter files land. And it all begins with one fateful tweet from journalist Matt Taibbi on December 2nd, 2022. The Twitter files, it starts. What you're about to read is the first installment in a series based upon thousands of internal documents obtained by sources by Twitter. And what it revealed was crystal clear. Twitter had acted on behalf of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and several other government agencies, directly to censor ideas that were inimical to government narratives, at the direct request of those government agencies. This is the very essence of the First Amendment. The whole reason to have a First Amendment, to protect free speech, is that government cannot come through and tell people that they can't say things that the government doesn't want them to say. There are a few tiny exceptions. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, right? You can't directly incite imminent violence, and you can't directly slander or libel someone. There's a few small exceptions, but basically there is no way to argue anything other than a violation of the Constitution when social media companies such as Twitter directly talk to government agencies on a weekly basis. Sometimes it was even more frequent, the Twitter files revealed. More frequent than weekly. Sometimes within hours. We need this guy taken down. We need that article reduced. How come you haven't done this yet? These are the kinds of communication that were happening between Twitter executives and people in the government. So that is why the essence of what the Twitter files revealed is so important to understand. That social media is directly in violation, Twitter at least, and we'll get to Facebook and Google later, but Twitter was in direct violation of the Constitution doing this. We also learned that the government can read everything, even your direct messaging, prompting some to say the whole site could be a honeypot. If you know what a honeypot is a technical device. It can also be a place or a person, but in the idea of computer programming, it's something that tempts hackers or tempts dissidents to come in and use it in order, because it's being carefully surveilled by the regulators, or being carefully surveilled by the government, will actually lure the dissidents or the criminals in. That's what a honeypot is. That seems a bit extreme for Twitter, but it's certainly something to think about. What's also really disturbing about this story is that when Matt Taibbi, who along with several other journalists was given these documents by Elon Musk, there were 5 or 6 different journalists, and I'll mention them in a minute, Matt Taibbi was called to Congress to testify about this. And he was grilled, particularly by people on the Democratic side, which for some reason Democrats seem much more interested or much more in support of this type of censorship, which I find baffling and disturbing. But so it was Democrats who were really grilling Matt Taibbi about this. And at the same time that he was being grilled in Congress, the IRS knocked on his door when he was gone and basically initiated a search of his house, which certainly looks like intimidation. And in an interview, Matt Taibbi said he didn't have anything unusual in his taxes that year. There were no special outstanding bills or anything. There's no even if there were, there's no reason for the IRS to come and knock on your door and search your house. I mean, that's disturbing, let's just say. So in summary, the reason the Twitter files are so important is because they reveal something that I and many others assumed was probably happening, showed lots of evidence that it could be happening, but now shows it beyond a shadow of a doubt. That Twitter was censoring journalists, censoring doctors, censoring scientists, anyone speaking out against the mainstream narratives about anything to do with COVID, about the Ukraine war, about any of these types of things where dissent is essential. I talk about in Red, White, and Blind why we need dissent in both science and democracy. You can't really have either science or democracy or any other of the bedrock principles that we've depended on since the Enlightenment for what we call Western civilization. You can't have these ideas if you don't allow dissent. If what you have is just one set of beliefs that is allowed, that's what we had before the Enlightenment. That's feudalism. That's the Catholic Church. That's the Earth is the center of the galaxy. Anybody that says anything different will be burned at the stake or will be put on the rack. If you dissent, you're a blasphemer or a witch, and it's our way or the highway. That is a tremendous move backwards, right? The only reason that we have democracy is because we need to acknowledge that there are multiple ideas, and on something as huge as a war or a mandate for a medical procedure or a lockdown of schools, there have to be different sides allowed to discuss this. It's similar for science. Science can go nowhere if there's just one answer on something like that. If there's something like controversial like the vaccines or climate change, but even more, normal, like sort of everyday things like a drug being approved. If you can only have one particular view and any other view can be censored or suppressed or shadow banned on social media, science will go nowhere. You will just have complete capture of what is called science, and it won't be science anymore. It'll be religion. That's religion, right? Where there's only one answer is allowed. So the Twitter files revealed massive collaboration between the government and the social media corporations, in this case Twitter, to shadow ban, censor, and suppress ideas and viewpoints that ran counter to what the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and CDC and other agencies wanted to be discussed. Now, as I've mentioned many times before, the solution to this is always to balance your media diet. And it's something I've written quite a bit about. A whole chapter of Red, White, and Blind is on this. And I'm just in the process of launching a new website called balancedmediadiet.com, which is going to help people to the extent that I'm able, and others that are collaborating with me to help others to balance their media diet. It's something that I do, and in preparation for every episode of this show, I read a diversity of sources, not just left and right, but top and bottom, sources that come from foreign news, corporate media on both the political Democrat and Republican side, but also news sources that go below the parties and beyond that in political analysis, all different types of sources, and it's really important. That's why the Balanced Media Diet exists. All right, well, that's all I have today about the Twitter files. We're going to be talking about a few other topics here. If you like this video, if you like this kind of discussion, please share and like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and with the Rumble algorithm that we're building a channel on Rumble as well because, we just talked about social media censorship. This channel could certainly be censored or shadow banned if it isn't already. So thank you so much for watching. My name's Tony Bersunas. This has been Red, White, and Blind.